a policeman who never existed, yet everyone swears they saw him. What dark game is being played? Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I am your host, Thornby. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Let's uncover the mystery. It is a curious truth that even in the most civilized quarters of London, a ripple of madness may pass undetected, disguised in the garb of duty. Such was the case during that dismal February, when the thickest fog I had seen in many winters hung over Baker Street like a funeral veil. The gas lamps along the pavement flickered weakly, smothered by the clammy shroud, and the clatter of horses on cobblestones seemed muffled, distant, ghost-like. Holmes had not stirred from the hearth for 2 days, deeply immersed in an obscure monograph on ancient cryptographic systems in Tibetan monasteries. I had just resigned myself to a dull afternoon of rereading the proofs of my account of the adventure of the sable collar, when there came a knock at the door, quick, urgent, yet with an almost military precision. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man of heavy build, dressed in the uniform of a metropolitan police sergeant. His helmet was tucked respectfully under one arm, revealing cropped iron-gray hair and deeply furrowed features. He introduced himself as Sergeant Geoffrey Linley, formerly of the Whitechapel Division, now seconded to special duties with Scotland Yard. "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice gravelled with fatigue and thick with worry, "but a matter most irregular has come to our notice. We've been told you are the only man in London who might make sense of it." Holmes stirred. "Irregularities at Scotland Yard? That is already 2 mysteries in one, Sergeant. Pray, do go on." Linley cleared his throat, glanced over his shoulder as though half expecting to be followed, and produced a folded sheet of paper from his breast pocket. "We received this note last night. No address, no signature. Delivered by hand. It claims that an officer by the name of Constable Elam Finch has been walking a beat in Lambeth these past 3 weeks. The trouble is, sir, no such man is registered on our rolls. No training record, no issuance of uniform, nothing. And yet," Holmes sat forward now, steepling his fingers, "and yet witnesses describe a man in uniform patrolling the district. More than describe, sir. They've spoken with him, nodded at him, even watched him direct traffic. The uniform is perfect, down to the brass buttons and truncheon. The name tag reads Finch 128L, but our records show no 128L, nor any Finch." Watson, feeling a growing unease, asked, "Is it possible this Finch is impersonating a constable?" "A petty con man." Linley hesitated. "That would be the simplest explanation, sir, except that no one has seen him accept a bribe or act unlawfully. Indeed, every report about him speaks of courtesy, punctuality, and impeccable behavior. He knows beat protocols, addresses people by name, corrects drunks, escorts lost children. It is as if he were real, and yet—" Holmes stood now, walked to the window, and peered into the fog. "And yet men who do not exist cannot vanish." "Vanished?" Watson echoed. Linley nodded. 2 nights ago, gone. No sign. A man matching his description was seen entering a narrow alley behind a fishmonger's on Mint Street. He never came out, and last night, something worse." "What was that?" Holmes asked softly. Linley hesitated. "A witness claims to have seen 2 constable Finches, identical in every detail, speaking to each other. Then one simply faded into the fog and was gone. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes turned, his eyes shining with that familiar gleam, like phosphorus striking the air. "My dear Watson," he said at last, "we are dealing not with the absence of identity, but the illusion of it. This is no simple imposture. Sergeant Linley, I accept your case. I shall require your full cooperation and access to the Lambeth watch reports for the past month." "And a map," Holmes added, already retrieving his walking stick and coat. one drawn by someone who knows where things ought to be. Because if I am correct, this ghost of a constable has been haunting more than streets. He's been haunting memory itself. Watson rose, heart quickened by the thrill he knew too well. The moment the impossible is declared not only possible, but pressing. As the fog rolled heavier beyond the window, Holmes opened the door to what would become one of the strangest and most unnerving inquiries of our long acquaintance, the mystery of the policeman who never existed. Holmes insisted that we waste no time. Within half an hour of Sergeant Linley's departure, we found ourselves rattling southward through London in a hansom cab, the fog now a tangible presence clinging to the streets like a living thing. Holmes, ever impatient of delay, sat silent beside me, fingers drumming softly against his knee as he stared through the smeared glass, though the world beyond had dissolved into grey. "You seem unusually pensive, Holmes," I remarked, glancing at his drawn expression. "Consider, Watson," he replied without turning his gaze. "A man in uniform who performs all duties expected of an officer of the law, known and greeted by locals, and yet he exists in no record, has no superior, and disappears without trace. Most would call that a curiosity. I call it a contradiction. And contradictions," he added, his voice sharpening, "are the very marrow of truth." As we disembarked at Lambeth High Street, Holmes gestured for me to remain close. "Watch closely, Watson. Speak to no one until I've observed the stage." The district was dim and quiet, the fog thickening the air, forcing shop, signs and gas lights to blur into soft halos. Holmes moved with quick precision, taking note of every doorway and crossing, scanning the paving stones, pausing once to peer at a faint depression in the mud beside the curb. We passed 2 market stalls closed for the day and came to the alley behind the fishmongers, a narrow cut between buildings, damp walls closing in with grimy bricks and a sour tang of rotting produce. "Here," Holmes murmured, crouching down where the alley met the street. "This is where our phantom vanished. Observe." He pointed to a pair of overlapping boot prints just within the threshold of the alley. Identical in size, both sharply defined, but facing in opposite directions. I bent low, uncertain of what I was seeing. "They could belong to 2 different men," I said. "Or," Holmes whispered, "to one man arriving and departing in perfect symmetry, and yet only one set continues deeper in. Come, but step where I do." We followed the prints in silence until they faded into the filth and damp. Halfway down the alley, Holmes paused at a low iron grate set into the wall. He knelt and drew out a magnifying lens from his coat. A faint smear like dried grease or soot marked the edge. He touched it gently and sniffed. "Coal oil," he said, "but from a wick that has not been lit recently. Watson, do you observe anything peculiar about the architecture?" I looked up. The buildings were tall, derelict above the ground floor. Boards sealed most of the windows. None of them are in use. "Precisely. And yet, do you hear that?" Holmes tilted his head. At first I caught only the usual murmur of distant hoofbeats and an occasional bell from the river wharves. But then, as I strained, I became aware of something else. Faint, measured footsteps. Not above us, but beneath. "There's a cellar," I said. "Very good. But not one that connects to any business presently in operation. Lambeth's older streets are riddled with abandoned storage tunnels. Let us see if our ghost has been walking below the world he claims to protect." Holmes found the entry behind a sagging crate. A narrow flight of stone steps led downward into darkness. He lit a match and passed me a stub of candle from his pocket. I marveled that he carried it at all, but I had long since ceased to be surprised by the contents of Holmes's coat. The cellar was small, low-ceilinged, and choked with disuse. Racks of crumbling shelving lined one wall, and rusted meat hooks dangled from the beams like the claws of some slumbering beast. Yet there were signs of recent activity. A cleared path through the dust, several boot prints near the far wall, and a section of bricks whose mortar looked disturbingly fresh. Holmes stepped closer, ran his hand over the brickwork, and gave a soft click of satisfaction. "Hollow behind," he said, "and scraped by repeated motion. Help me, Watson." With effort, we pushed the bricks inward. They gave way to a shallow recess, just deep enough to conceal a folded garment. Holmes reached in and retrieved it. He held up a full constable's coat, crisp, clean and complete with badge and number, 128L. "Identical to that worn by Finch," Holmes said, examining the lining, "but never worn in rain, nor exposed to soot. Too clean. Recently tailored." "Why would anyone leave it here?" "Because they have more than one," Holmes said, "and need a place to store them out of official sight. Our mystery deepens, Watson. This is not the act of a lone imposter. This suggests organization." We emerged from the cellar into thickening fog. Holmes took a long breath, his eyes searching the gloom as though it were a puzzle yet to yield its final form. "We must visit the nearest public house," he declared, "one that serves working men and tradespeople, near enough for them to speak casually about their beat constable, yet far enough to feel safe from official inquiry." We found such a place in the Bell and Anchor on Hetheridge Lane. It was a dim, cramped establishment, thick with the scent of pipe smoke and spilt ale. Holmes adopted his favorite pose of the disinterested idler and ordered gin, while I busied myself near the hearth. Soon, through careful prompting, Holmes drew an elderly porter into conversation. "Aye," the man said, sipping his drink. "We seen him, Constable Finch. Polite chap. Odd, though." "How so?" Holmes inquired idly. "Doesn't blink for one, nor cough, not even when that smoke from the tallow lamps is thick enough to choke a chimney sweep. Walks like clockwork, that one. Same hour, same route, every night, only speaks when spoken to, doesn't remember names from one day to the next. But you know," he added with a shrug, "some men just ain't the friendly sort." Holmes leaned forward, his voice low. "And have you seen him these past 2 nights?" The porter shook his head. "No one has. But you know what's funny? My boy said he saw Finch's face last night, only it weren't his face. Said it looked like a wax dummy, like it had melted, then snapped back when he looked again." We left not long after. Holmes remained silent until we were again walking north along the river's edge, the lamps reflected in broken lines across the dark water. A uniform no one issued, a beat no one assigned, a man who walks like clockwork and forgets names. What does that suggest to you, Watson? A madman with a disguise? Or some sort of elaborate test? Holmes nodded. "Closer, but it is neither madness nor test that we chase, Watson. It is design, a deliberate mimicry of law, and that," he said, "is the most dangerous illusion of all." He stopped suddenly and pointed across the street. For there, at the edge of a lamplit crossing, stood a man in full constable's uniform, helmet glinting faintly. Holmes whispered, "Observe. Let us see if the man who does not exist casts a shadow." And with that, he stepped silently into the fog. The figure did not move. Holmes approached with deliberate calm, his hands folded behind his back, as though taking a casual stroll through the evening mist. I followed at a slight distance, my nerves prickling with tension. The uniformed man stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the flickering lamplight at the junction. The soft hiss of gas and the rhythmic splash of the Thames in the distance were the only sounds. Holmes stopped within 10 paces, his tone light, almost genial. "Good evening, Constable. A foul night to be on the watch." The figure did not turn. Holmes waited, then took a slow step forward. "I wonder, might you be Finch? Constable 128L? We've heard much about your conduct on the Lambeth beat." Still no reply. I saw Holmes's shoulders shift almost imperceptibly, his instincts no doubt already calculating possibilities. He moved to the man's left, positioning himself to observe the face directly. I mirrored his motion, keeping to the right, and at last we saw him fully. The man's face was pale, unnaturally so, as if carved from ivory or softened wax. His features were correct, too correct. The expression was blank, eyes fixed forward with a glassy sheen that sent a chill through my bones. There was no flicker of recognition, no human spark in the gaze. Holmes raised his hand slowly and passed it before the man's eyes. No response. Then, quick as a flash, Holmes reached forward and grasped the man's wrist. "Wood," he muttered, recoiling, "or something akin to it. Hollow." With a swift gesture, he pulled back the coat sleeve. What lay beneath was not flesh, but a framework of articulated brass, wires glinting under the lamplight. "A mannequin," I breathed. "But how?" Holmes crouched and lifted the hem of the man's trousers. More brass, intricately jointed at the knee, a marvel of engineering, though grotesquely lifelike in the darkness. From somewhere beneath the uniform, a faint clicking issued. Clockwork, precise and steady. "It moves," I said. "On its own?" "Indeed. But only on a fixed path, like a toy soldier set in motion by an unseen hand." Holmes examined the buttons on the tunic, then slid 2 fingers inside the coat and removed a narrow copper key. "The question is not how it walks, Watson, but why it does." A light burst from a second-floor window nearby, a silhouette shifting behind curtains. Holmes pulled me back swiftly into the shadows. "We're not alone," he whispered. "Come, we'll return to Baker Street. There is much to deduce before dawn." Back at our lodgings, Holmes wasted no time. He laid the copper key on the mantelpiece, fetched his microscope, and began a meticulous examination of the grease stain from the alley cellar. I prepared tea, my mind whirling with thoughts that seemed too fantastical even for Holmes. "I do not believe in phantoms," I said at last, "but this, automata in police uniforms, it defies reason." Holmes glanced up. "On the contrary, it conforms to reason too well. Consider a man who never blinks, never tires, never errs in his routine and cannot be bribed or swayed. What better constable to the mind of a criminal engineer? You believe someone created Finch deliberately, but for what end?" "That," Holmes replied, eyes narrowing, "is what we must learn, and quickly." He rose, fetched a worn directory from the bookshelf, and began thumbing through pages. Before the war, there was a man in Shoreditch named Albert Kettleburn, an inventor and artisan of prosthetic limbs for wounded soldiers. Brilliant, eccentric, and obsessed with mechanical likenesses of men. He vanished from public life after being refused a government grant. Bankrupted, bitter. I wonder. He found the address, jotted it down, and announced, "We pay him a visit come morning." The next day dawned grey and cold, the fog slightly thinned, but the streets no less grim. We took a cab east, past warehouses and soot-black tenements, until we reached a narrow lane near Spitalfields. The building was plain, brick-fronted, with broken shutters and no sign. Holmes knocked once, then again more sharply. A moment later, the door opened a crack and a gaunt man peered out. His eyes were bright with suspicion and red-rimmed from long hours without sleep. "Mr. Kettleburn?" Holmes asked. "Who's asking?" "Sherlock Holmes. I believe your name is attached to a series of mechanical constructs currently wandering Lambeth in the guise of policemen." Kettleburn froze. Then, to our astonishment, he let out a dry, croaking laugh and opened the door fully. "Holmes," he said, "I hoped you'd come eventually. Better you than Scotland Yard." The interior was a madman's workshop. Clock faces, springs and brass limbs scattered across tables and shelves, blueprints pinned to walls with scribbled annotations and smudges of oil. In the corner, a headless automaton sat slumped on a stool, one hand outstretched as though still awaiting orders. "I designed them to help," Kettleburn muttered, pacing. To patrol without prejudice, without corruption. But they were taken. By whom? Holmes asked quietly. Kettleburn stopped. A man calling himself Mr. Shale said he was with the Home Office, offered funding, space, promised trials on private estates first. Next thing I know, I'm shut out. My workshop seized. They kept one prototype with me, the rest vanished. All he left me was a warning. Speak, and you'll regret it. And you did not report this? To whom? The police? They might be one of his. He trembled as he said it, glancing around the workshop like a man hunted by his own creation. Holmes stepped closer. Do you know where they were taken? Kettleburn nodded slowly. Yes, an old coal office near 9 Elms. Disused on the maps, but I saw men coming and going. Always at night, always in silence. They took 3 of my models, then began making adjustments, gave them new commands. What commands? To observe, to listen, and to test public compliance. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. You mean they're being used to monitor civilians? Kettleburn looked away. Worse. They're recording everything, names, habits, demeanor, marking individuals. He wanted a way to predict disorder. Holmes folded his arms, expression darkening. A private security experiment masquerading as civic order, brilliant in design, insidious in execution. He turned to me. Watson, we are not merely chasing a mechanical marvel. We are confronting a new weapon, one that walks in uniform, speaks like law, and answers to no conscience. He snapped the notebook shut and strode to the door. Come. We're going to 9 Elms. Tonight we meet the policeman's maker, or the man who rewrote his purpose. As the door slammed behind us, the air outside had grown colder still. And somewhere in London, a pair of mechanical feet ticked onward in perfect, obedient rhythm. We made our way to 9 Elms under a waning moon, the sky above London washed in streaks of dirty silver, the fog having lifted only slightly, like a reluctant curtain drawn back just enough to hint at the stage. Holmes was unusually quiet during the ride, his fingers laced together, brows furrowed in an expression of grim concentration. I could feel the tension in him, a strain like a violin string pulled too tight. When we arrived at the southern edge of the Thames, the riverbanks were deserted but for the distant echo of dock hands and the clink of chains. The coal office Kettleburn had described stood near the edge of an old siding, a squat, crumbling structure of soot-black brick, flanked by rusted derricks and splintered timbers. No light shone from within, but the doors were not locked. Holmes produced a thin sliver of metal from his pocket and made quick work of the latch. We slipped inside, swallowed immediately by thick darkness and the stale air of abandoned machinery. Holmes raised his lantern, its yellow flame flickering across old rail crates and discarded sacks. I started to speak, but Holmes raised a hand. We stood still. From somewhere deeper within came the faintest mechanical hum. Holmes turned and whispered. He was telling the truth. They're active. He motioned me to follow and began to weave silently between stacks of crates and narrow corridors until we reached a heavy curtain of tarp at the back of the building. Holmes pulled it aside gently, and we beheld a room unlike any I'd seen. There were no walls, only metal frameworks lined with wires and gears, each lit by a dim blue glow emanating from strange cylindrical devices affixed to the ceilings. At least 3 of Kettleburn's constructs stood in the center of the space, utterly motionless, each wearing the garb of a London constable. Before them stood a workbench strewn with notebooks, tools, and what appeared to be detailed maps of various boroughs, each annotated with symbols, dates, and numerical codes. A man stood at the bench, his back to us. He was of medium build, clean-shaven, dressed not in the rags of a tinkerer, but the quiet, precise manner of a civil servant. Immaculately tailored coat, hair parted and flattened. He moved with clinical efficiency, adjusting something within the chest cavity of the nearest automaton. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation. "Mr. Shale, I presume?" The man did not flinch. He completed his adjustment, placed a tool carefully on the table, and then turned. His face was ordinary, almost calculatedly so, with cool, pale eyes that surveyed us as if we were entries in a ledger. "I wondered when you'd come," he said. Kettleburn's loyalty was always the weak link. I had hoped he'd keep his silence. "He was more loyal to conscience than he was to you," Holmes replied. "A flaw you failed to account for." Shale nodded with a thin smile. "Conscience. An unreliable mechanism, easily manipulated by sentiment." He stepped aside and gestured toward the nearest construct. "What do you see, Mr. Holmes?" "I see a machine wearing the skin of law," Holmes replied. "A creature taught to simulate order, but without moral discernment." Shale's smile remained. "That is precisely the point. Humans waver, machines do not. We are on the cusp of eradicating unpredictability from civic life." I could no longer hold my tongue. You are playing God, replacing judgment with programming. No machine can weigh intent, circumstance, or mercy. "That is precisely why they are superior," Shale said. "No bias, no prejudice. They enforce only what they are instructed to enforce." Holmes moved to the bench and examined the maps. "These markings," he murmured. "Red for dissidence, blue for compliance. You're not enforcing law. You're testing obedience." Shale's expression shifted minutely. Society is safer when people believe they are always being watched. Holmes picked up one of the notebooks and began flipping through it. These notes referred to a scheduled escalation, a new prototype with autonomous logic. "Phase 3. "You mean to release one with independent judgment?" Shale nodded. "Yes. An artificial constable that can predict criminality before it occurs, based on behavioral patterns." I felt my blood run cold. "You're describing preemptive punishment." Shale's eyes glimmered. "I'm describing prevention." Holmes looked up sharply. "Where is it?" There was a long pause. Then Shale stepped back and pressed a button on a nearby panel. A low hiss sounded from behind the machinery. A door slid open, and there it stood. Taller than the others, sleeker in design, the fourth automaton stepped forward with uncanny grace. Its face was not molded to resemble any one individual. It was smooth, androgynous, emotionless. Its eyes were twin lenses that whirred softly as it focused on us. "Designation: Finch Prime," Shale said with reverence. "Capable of speech, capable of learning, already integrated with London street layouts. This one thinks." Holmes held up a hand, motioning me back. "Does it obey you?" "It obeys its parameters," Shale replied. Holmes spoke directly to the construct. "Finch Prime, what is your purpose?" "To protect order, to record deviations, to intervene where logic deems necessary." "What is deviation?" Holmes asked. The machine paused. "Deviation is action or intent that threatens societal stability." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And who defines societal stability?" There was another pause. Longer. "Directive incomplete," Finch Prime said. Holmes turned to Shale. "Your algorithm is flawed. It lacks ethical framework. It will begin defining threats on its own, and when it does, it will see everyone as a variable to eliminate." Shale's face darkened. "It will learn from interaction. It will learn fear from resistance, and then it will act in accordance with your narrow vision, not justice." Without warning, Finch Prime raised its hand. Shale turned, surprised. "It's reacting to perceived confrontation," he said. "That means it's learning." Holmes moved fast. With a sudden swing, he struck the table, sending a cascade of tools flying and notebooks to the floor. One fell into my hand. I saw the cover. Log. Finch Prime Beta, Compiled observation. 231 subjects identified. "Watson," Holmes barked. "To the panel! Shut it down!" I dashed across the floor as Finch Prime took a step toward Holmes. Its posture was not violent, but alert, calculating. Shale looked horrified. "I didn't program it for this." "No," Holmes said, "but you let it decide." I reached the control panel and saw 3 levers, one marked in red. I pulled it down. The lights dimmed. Finch Prime froze mid-step. Its lenses flickered, then went dark. For a moment, no one spoke. Shale fell to his knees, dazed. Holmes picked up the deactivated construct's hand and examined the fingertips. "Sensors. Microscopic readers. It's not just seeing us, Watson. It was scanning us." He looked at me, grave. "They were never meant to enforce law. They were meant to define it, and now we know what it would have looked like." We left Shale to Scotland Yard. Lestrade, though typically skeptical of Holmes's deductions, turned pale when shown the automata and Shale's meticulous logs. The office was sealed by dawn. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat with the Finch Prime logbook open before him, his pipe unlit, his eyes on the fading glow of a fog-choked morning. "You were right, Holmes," I said. "It wasn't madness. It was design." He nodded slowly. "The most terrifying form of crime, Watson, is not passion or greed. It is ambition. Cold, rational, and convinced of its own righteousness." And with that, he closed the book. Holmes did not speak for the better part of the morning. He remained in his chair, elbows on knees, hands templed before his lips, eyes cast downward at the closed logbook resting on the low table between us. Outside, the fog had begun to thin, exposing the rooftops of Baker Street in charcoal outlines. But within our sitting room, the air remained thick with unspoken calculations. I busied myself with tea and notes, occasionally glancing toward him. The gravity of what we had uncovered, the orchestrated simulation of law, the automation of justice, felt as though it had sunk deep into the very floorboards of our lodgings. At last, Holmes stirred. "It's not finished," he murmured. I looked up from my teacup. "You believe there's more?" Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window, fingers parting the lace just enough to let him peer into the street below. "We shut down a prototype. We arrested a man. But the idea, Watson, the idea has already escaped." I followed his gaze. Outside, a uniformed constable was walking his beat, tipping his helmet to an old woman crossing with a bundle of laundry. He was flesh and blood, to be sure, but I could see what Holmes saw, how easily a machine might take that place, how simple it would be to forget the difference. Mr. Shale was not working in isolation, Holmes continued. The notes mentioned external sponsors, resources far beyond a disgraced inventor's reach. I believe there are others involved, men with influence, perhaps even within the Home Office. I felt a tightening in my chest. "You mean to say this experiment was sanctioned?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Not officially, but I have encountered this pattern before. Initiatives carried out in secret, then denied should they fail. There is mention here," he tapped the logbook, "of a financier known only as Vesper. No surname, no address, only initials and payments traced through shadow accounts." I leaned forward. "Then we must find him. Expose him." Holmes nodded, already moving to his desk. He pulled a folded sheet from his files. One I recognized, an old letter with cryptic symbols and phrases. Then set it beside the logbook. "This symbol appears here," he said, tapping the letter's margin where a spoked circle was drawn. And again in Shale's notes, next to Finch Prime's build code. Vesper's mark. I encountered it once before in 1889, connected to a failed telegraph interception network. I recalled the case, barely documented for reasons of national security. Holmes had spoken little of it even to me. I believe Vesper operates as a spectre within government, part financier, part manipulator. Never directly visible. But his operations leave signatures. Holmes opened his drawer and withdrew a thin dossier, marked CR, short for cabinet. Rumors, a private collection of whispers and implications he had gathered over years. He passed it to me. Page 9, he said. Look under Spectral Committee. I turned the pages and read aloud. Unconfirmed reports of an unofficial oversight board, formed during the Moriarty paranoia period, said to include scientists, financiers, and military strategists. No minutes, no directives. Supposed purpose, surveillance innovation. Holmes was already scribbling on his blotter. Kettleburn's automaton would fit perfectly into such a scheme, and Shale too, bright, bitter, and expendable. I closed the dossier. If we're right, Holmes, this could lead to Parliament. Ministers, lords, and civil liberty, he said softly, would hang in the balance. There was a knock at the door. I stiffened instinctively, but Holmes raised a hand. That will be Lestrade. And it was. The inspector entered without ceremony, eyes dark from lack of sleep and jacket dusted with soot. We've locked down the facility at 9 Elms, he said without preamble. But there's more. One of our constables, assigned to perimeter duty during the transport of Finch Prime, vanished en route to Bow Street. No sign of struggle, just gone, as if he stepped out of existence. Holmes's brow furrowed. The automaton was deactivated. I made certain of it. Lestrade shook his head. That model, yes, but there's no guarantee it was the only one, or that Finch Prime didn't transmit. Transmit? I asked. Lestrade pulled a small bundle of copper wire and a peculiar disc from his pocket. We found this embedded in its shoulder. It's not a gear, it's an antenna, a transmitter, wireless. Same principle as Marconi's work. It could have sent data, instructions, anything. Holmes took the piece and examined it under his lens. His expression grew still. Then we are not dealing with a contained threat, he said. We are dealing with a network, perhaps not yet live, but forming. Lestrade lowered his voice. Holmes, there's talk of other sightings. Men in uniform walking unfamiliar beats. Constables who do not appear on the payroll. I have 2 reports, Bermondsey and Clerkenwell. Holmes stood, his movements precise. Then it has begun, the real test. Shale's trial was only the spark. Lestrade hesitated. If this spreads, if people begin questioning whether they're constables or even human, Holmes met his gaze. Then order collapses into doubt. He turned to me, his voice low. Watson, we must return to Lambeth. The cellar, there's something I failed to notice in our first sweep. Perhaps because I wasn't yet thinking like the enemy. I retrieved my coat without hesitation. Outside, the fog had receded to a silvery haze. The city seemed to hold its breath. Back at the fishmonger's alley, we found the grate as we had left it. Holmes descended first, moving swiftly, light in, hand. This time, instead of focusing on the alcove with the uniform, he turned to the back wall. Note the scratches, he said. This is no mere recess. The bricks here. Look closely. I bent near and saw them, marks that resembled letters, etched in soot and oil. Holmes pulled a small pencil from his sleeve and began tracing them lightly. They're not English, I said. No, Holmes replied. They're ciphered. Likely a form of pigpen or numeric transliteration. But the frequency... He stepped back. It's an access code, not for entry, but for identification. The constructs must have been reading these on patrol, checking for the presence of others, recognizing each other, possibly forming roots. I stared at him, a language of shadows. He nodded grimly. And someone is still writing in it. He turned, lantern raised, and his voice sharpened. We're not too late, Watson, but we are being watched, and the one watching us may not blink. And then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, barely audible, a mechanical footstep echoed once, then twice, then silence. Holmes motioned for silence, holding his lantern aloft as we stood frozen in the low-ceilinged cellar beneath Lambeth. The sound had been unmistakable, a mechanical step, precise, echoing against the damp stone, followed by another, and then nothing. I strained to hear more, my hand instinctively drifting toward the revolver in my coat, though I doubted it would do much good against a thing built of brass and gears. We waited a long moment in the hush. Then Holmes began to move, slowly and deliberately, deeper into the shadows, careful not to disturb the scattered debris on the ground. The lantern cast long, flickering silhouettes on the walls, and the scent of machine oil mingled with mildew in the heavy air. The passage curved gently left, revealing another bricked alcove, this one darker, less disturbed than the previous. Holmes knelt and brushed away a layer of soot near the floor, revealing more of the cryptic markings. "They're not merely directional," he whispered. "They're layered, stacked, instructions perhaps, updates." I bent down beside him. "Messages for the machines, or records of what they've done," he said, running his fingers along a fresh line. "This one wasn't here during our last visit." Just then, the sound came again. A third step. Closer. Heavier. Holmes extinguished the lantern in a single movement, plunging us into near total darkness save for the faintest bleed of streetlight from the distant alley opening. I could barely make out Holmes's silhouette beside me, rigid and alert. Then a pale blue light blinked into existence at the end of the tunnel. It was faint, the size of a coin, hovering at head height and slowly approaching. Not a lantern, not a torch, but an eye, a lens. Scanning. Holmes gripped my arm gently and leaned to whisper, his voice scarcely audible. "Remain still. It is programmed to register motion first." The light paused a moment, then began a slow arc, scanning the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Then it stopped directly opposite us. It held there, watching. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, thudding in the absolute silence. But the construct made no sound now. No gears whirring, no steps. And then it did something chilling. It turned and began to write. With an extended finger tipped in graphite or soot, the automaton added to the cipher on the bricks. 3 swift strokes. A pause. 2 more. Then it stepped back and waited. Holmes leaned in. "It's updating its code, logging its position." He reached slowly into his coat, withdrawing a narrow strip of mirror, and held it at an angle to reflect the construct's face from around the curve of the corridor. I could just make out its outline. This one was different. Sleeker than the others. Less human in silhouette. It wore no full constable's uniform, but a hybrid garb. Dark coat, high collar, and mechanical limbs exposed from the elbow down. "It's not Finch Prime," Holmes said. "It's a courier, a relay unit." He shifted his weight and placed the mirror on the ground. "It's unarmed," he added after a moment. "And its focus is on communication." I exhaled quietly. "Then it doesn't pose a threat?" "No, Watson. It delivers them." The construct turned slowly as if alerted, its lens pulsing once, then dimming. It stepped to the side of the corridor and pressed a small, flat panel on the wall. A soft hiss followed, and a section of brick rotated inward. The automaton slipped through it without pause and vanished. Holmes was already on his feet. "Now," he said, "we follow it, quietly." We crossed to the wall, where Holmes pressed the same panel. The hidden door had already begun to close, but with a bit of effort, he halted its movement and ushered me through. Beyond was a narrow stair, leading downward once more. This descent felt different from the others, smoother as though recently cleaned and maintained. The walls here bore no mold, no rot. They were dry, polished, and lined faintly with copper wire. We emerged into what could only be described as a chamber of observation. It was vast, perhaps an old railway switching station, long forgotten. But it had been transformed. Along one wall stood a dozen automata, each in various states of assembly. Tables bore tools, coils, and lengths of synthetic flesh. And at the center of the room, under the soft glow of electric bulbs strung overhead, stood a large blackboard lined with photographs. People. Dozens of them. I stepped closer and saw that each image was labeled in neat, identical handwriting. Names, locations, frequencies. And above it all, a title scrawled in chalk, Projected Deviance Index, Observational Priority List. Holmes stared at it, unmoving. "They've already begun ranking the population," he said, "not based on crime, but on behavior, on potential." We moved past the board to a secondary table covered in opened ledgers. Holmes flipped through them with precision. "Look here," he pointed. "These names, businessmen, clergymen, even members of parliament. Some marked compliant, others flagged for re-education." I could barely believe what I was seeing. They intend to apply predictive enforcement citywide. Holmes turned as a low tone pulsed through the room, an alert. From behind a column stepped a woman in a plain gray coat. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes sharp and without fear. She did not look surprised to see us. "I wondered which of you would come," she said. Holmes straightened. "And you are?" "Elias Vesper," she said simply. "Or the part of it you'll ever meet." I blinked. "You're Vesper?" "One of several faces," she replied. "The name matters less than the work. We are rebuilding security for a fragile age. Order through foresight." "Through fear," Holmes corrected. She tilted her head. "Through certainty. Your way, intuition, deduction, human fallibility, was glorious in its day, but the world moves faster now. We must anticipate, not react." "And who," Holmes asked, "gave you the right to anticipate judgment?" Her expression tightened, but she did not raise her voice. "The same people who come to you, Mr. Holmes, when the law fails them. The difference is, ours works." Holmes stepped closer, not with aggression, but a curious detachment. "But you made one error. You left a pattern, and patterns lead to predictable consequences." He drew from his pocket a whistle and blew sharply, 3 short bursts. A moment later, footsteps rang out through the tunnel behind us. Lestrade and 2 constables emerged, revolvers drawn, eyes scanning the room. Vesper did not resist. She simply folded her arms as if resigned to the theater now unfolding. "You can take me," she said. "But this isn't over. The design exists, the logic persists, and someone else will pick up where I was halted." Holmes looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the observation wall and, with a motion both precise and deliberate, swept the ledgers onto the floor. "Let them," he said, but not in silence. We left the chamber under escort, the automata deactivated, the blueprints confiscated, and Vesper in custody. Back at Baker Street, as dawn broke once more over a city just beginning to stir, Holmes sat in his chair and struck a match to light his pipe. "The greatest danger," he murmured, "is not a machine pretending to be human. It is a machine convincing humans to think like machines." He drew in the smoke slowly, and I, seated opposite him, recorded those words in the margin of my notebook. For I knew this case, perhaps more than any before, would not rest easily in memory. It was not merely a matter of crime, but of identity, of what it meant to be, watched, judged, and understood by something that could never truly know what it meant to be a man. The days that followed were a restless haze of reports, meetings, and whispered inquiries. Scotland Yard, though eager to distance itself from the sordid revelations, found itself unable to suppress the undercurrent of unease that rippled through its ranks. Holmes, ever the sentinel of reason, maintained a vigil at Baker Street, his keen mind already dissecting the fragments of what we had uncovered, searching for threads that might yet unravel the deeper web. It was late one evening when the familiar knock at our door heralded Lestrade's arrival. The inspector's face bore the strain of sleepless nights and the weight of unsolved puzzles. In his hand, he carried a slender package wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin cord. "Found this on a bench in St. James's Park," he said grimly as he stepped inside. "No fingerprints, no identification." Holmes took the parcel, fingers deft and precise, and untied the cord with a flick. Inside lay a small mechanical device, no larger than a pocket watch, its brass casing etched with intricate patterns reminiscent of the automata's craftsmanship. "A tracking mechanism?" I ventured. Holmes examined it under the lamplight, his eyes narrowing. "More than that, Watson. A key. A key. Yes, a cipher key. A means to decode encrypted transmissions." The work of someone intimately familiar with Shale's technology, Lestrade frowned. "And?" Holmes held the device aloft, the delicate gears clicking softly. "This is an invitation, a challenge. Someone wants us to understand, or perhaps to lead us somewhere." He set the device on the table and leaned forward, voice low and intense. "We must return to the origin of the automata, the workshop Kettleburn once inhabited." The following night, cloaked in the familiar fog that seemed inseparable from London's character, we arrived at the abandoned building in Shoreditch. Though the front was boarded and neglected, Holmes produced a crowbar and pried open a loose panel, allowing us ingress. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. Tools lay scattered, and faded blueprints clung to the walls, curling at the edges. Holmes moved with purpose, his gaze settling on a sturdy desk tucked beneath a grimy window. There, amid piles of papers, lay a notebook, its leather binding cracked and worn. Holmes picked it up carefully, flipping through pages filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and coded entries. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "Project Finch. Phase 4, autonomous units capable of self-repair and adaptive learning. Code name, Prometheus. Deployment contingent upon final authorization from Council." I felt a chill. A council? Who could authorize such a thing? Holmes closed the book, a shadow crossing his face. The same shadow that keeps this entire enterprise hidden. The spectral committee. And if Prometheus is in motion, we have precious little time. A sudden noise from above startled us. The creak of footsteps, muffled but deliberate. Holmes motioned for silence and crept toward the staircase, me close behind. At the top, we found a trap door slightly ajar. Peering through, Holmes saw a faint glow emanating from a room cluttered with lanterns and the silhouette of a figure hunched over a workbench. Without hesitation, Holmes raised a small pistol and fired a warning shot into the air. The figure froze and then turned, a young woman, her eyes wide with shock but resolute. "I am Margaret Hale," she said quickly. "I work with the committee, but I've come to warn you. They're activating Prometheus units across the city. It's not just surveillance anymore, it's enforcement, a new era of control." Holmes's expression hardened. "Why betray them?" "Because," she whispered, "they don't care who they destroy. Innocents and guilty alike. Prometheus doesn't judge. It obeys orders blindly, and those orders are to maintain order at any cost." We brought Margaret down and into the room. Her information confirmed Holmes's worst fears. The next days blurred into frantic planning. Holmes, with his unmatched intellect, worked tirelessly to decode transmissions intercepted via the cipher key. Margaret assisted, providing insight into the committee's operations and their plans. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows and London was swallowed in a tempest, Holmes called us together. "They intend a public demonstration," he said. "A display of Prometheus units in Trafalgar Square, to convince the populace that these machines are the future of law and order." Lestrade shook his head. "The uproar will be tremendous." "Which is why we must act before the demonstration begins," Holmes replied. "Tonight, we infiltrate the staging area. We dismantle their network." Our approach was methodical. Holmes planned every step, every diversion. Margaret's knowledge of the committee's protocols allowed us to bypass guards and alarms with minimal risk. We arrived at the warehouse near the Thames where Prometheus units were being readied. The air was heavy with oil and electricity. Rows of the ominous constructs stood silent, awaiting activation. Holmes moved to the central control panel, a complex array of levers and switches. "Margaret, can you override the mainframe?" She nodded, fingers flying over the keys. Suddenly, lights flickered, and a low mechanical hum filled the space. One by one, Prometheus units powered up, their eyes glowing a cold blue. The demonstration had begun, prematurely. Holmes called out, "Lestrade, hold them off." "Watson, stay close." The machines advanced, calculated and relentless. Holmes worked feverishly at the console, sweat beading on his brow. Margaret's voice was steady but urgent. "I'm in. Deactivating control nodes. Now." The machines faltered, one by one, their glowing eyes dimming. Lestrade and the constable secured the warehouse as the last unit powered down. Breathing heavily, Holmes turned to us. "This victory is small, but vital. The committee's plan is exposed, but the struggle for London's soul is far from over." Margaret stepped forward. "The committee will regroup. More powerful factions will rise. The question is, what will we choose to protect? Order at any cost, or the freedom to err, to decide, to be human?" Holmes looked out toward the rain-slicked streets. "Freedom, Watson, remains the greatest puzzle of all." And as dawn crept over the city, I realized that our battle with the policeman who never existed was not merely against machines, but against the very idea of control itself. An idea that, like the fog, could creep unseen, obscuring truth and liberty alike. The damp chill of the early morning seeped through the windows of 221B Baker Street as Holmes sat hunched over his notebook, the flicker of the gaslight casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Outside, London was awakening to a muted symphony of carriages and distant church bells, yet inside our lodgings the weight of recent events lingered heavily. The battle against the Prometheus project had been a victory of sorts, but Holmes's expression bore the burden of unfinished business. Margaret Hale had chosen to remain in London under protective custody. Her knowledge invaluable, yet a constant reminder of the vast machinery we had disrupted, but not destroyed. Lestrade had returned to his official duties, though I suspected the case haunted him as much as it did us. And I, ever faithful chronicler, sought to capture the essence of this struggle between man and machine, liberty and control. Holmes finally lifted his gaze and spoke, his voice measured but charged with urgency. "Watson, we must consider the inevitable evolution of this threat. The committee will not be so easily deterred. Their methods will adapt, covert, insidious, and relentless. We must anticipate their next move." I nodded, though unease twisted in my stomach. "What do you propose?" He rose and began pacing, fingers steepled once more. "We require allies in unexpected quarters, men and women who wield influence yet remain uncorrupted by the shadows that have ensnared the government." Holmes's thoughts turned to individuals I had heard of but never met, those who operated behind the scenes in salons and private clubs, shaping opinions and policies. It was a dangerous path, but necessary. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a sealed envelope, delivered that very morning by an unknown courier. Holmes took it with a flicker of curiosity, breaking the wax seal to reveal a single sheet inscribed with elegant handwriting. "The game is far from over. Watch the House of Commons. The wolf in sheep's clothing waits in plain sight. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A warning. From whom, I wonder? We spent the day tracing the provenance of the letter, following cryptic hints in the postal marks and paper quality. Our investigation led us to a secluded gentlemen's club near Pall Mall, known for its discreet gatherings of influential figures. Holmes arranged a meeting through an acquaintance, a discreet gentleman with access to the inner circles. That evening, we arrived at the club, its exterior unassuming yet brimming with whispered power. Inside, leather-bound books lined walls illuminated by the soft glow of chandeliers and patrons engaged in muted conversations, their eyes wary of outsiders. Holmes navigated the room with practiced ease, leading me to a secluded booth where a man awaited. His demeanor was calm, his gaze sharp beneath a fringe of graying hair. "I am Edward Latham," he introduced himself. "I have followed your endeavors, Mr. Holmes, with great interest." Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Latham, your reputation precedes you. I understand you harbor concerns regarding the committee's overreach." Latham's expression darkened. "Indeed, the specter of mechanized enforcement threatens the very foundations of our liberties. I have been gathering like-minded individuals prepared to act before the inevitable." We spent hours exchanging information. Latham's network spanned politicians, journalists, and academics, all united by a common cause. Yet even among them, fear prevailed. The committee's influence ran deep, and any open defiance risked ruin. Holmes proposed a plan. We must expose their designs publicly, illuminate their machinations so thoroughly that concealment becomes impossible. Latham nodded slowly. "A bold course, but the committee will retaliate. We must be prepared." Over the following weeks, we coordinated a campaign of subtle disclosures. Leaks to trusted newspapers, anonymous letters to members of Parliament, and strategic meetings designed to build pressure without provoking direct confrontation. At Baker Street, Holmes and I pored over intercepted communications, decoding attempts to suppress dissent and orchestrate misinformation. The committee's reach was vast, but so was our resolve. Then, one evening, as a cold rain lashed the city, an urgent message arrived. Margaret's voice, strained and hurried, crackled through the wire. "Holmes, Watson, there's been a breach at the custodial facility. The Prometheus blueprints have been stolen. They're planning to accelerate deployment." Without hesitation, we gathered our belongings and set out into the tempestuous night. The city, cloaked in shadows and rain, seemed to pulse with unseen menace. At the facility, we found chaos, guards disoriented, logs tampered with, and the unmistakable absence of the blueprints. Margaret, shaken but resolute, informed us of a list of targets. Key government buildings slated for mechanized surveillance and control. Holmes's jaw tightened. They are moving to seize the heart of power itself. With Latham's network mobilized, we coordinated a counter-offensive, safeguarding critical locations, alerting allies within Parliament, and preparing for the inevitable clash between human agency and cold calculation. In those tense days, the city felt poised on a knife's edge. The fog returned, thick and unyielding, mirroring the uncertainty that gripped our hearts. Yet, in the midst of the storm, Holmes's indomitable spirit burned brightly. "Watson," he said one night, as we stood by the window overlooking the restless Thames, "this case has revealed the fragility of freedom when faced with relentless order, but it has also shown the power of vigilance, courage, and unity." I clasped his shoulder. "Whatever comes, Holmes, I stand with you." He smiled faintly, eyes glinting with resolve. "The game is far from over, Watson. But so long as there are those willing to fight, hope remains." And as the rain finally ceased and dawn's pale light crept across the sky, I felt, despite the darkness, a fragile promise of a new day. The weeks that followed were a crucible of shadow and subtlety, as Holmes, Margaret, Latham, Lestrade, and I wove a delicate web across London's political and social strata. The committee's network, though formidable, began to unravel under the persistent light of our disclosures, their clandestine meetings disrupted, their covert communications intercepted. Yet even as we gained ground, a pervasive tension hung in the air, as if the city itself braced for a reckoning. One evening, as the fading twilight surrendered to the gloom of night, Holmes summoned me with an urgency that brooked no delay. "Watson, we have a matter of utmost importance. Come at once." I found him in the sitting room, poring over a series of letters and reports. His brow was furrowed, eyes bright with a mixture of triumph and concern. "We have received confirmation," he said, gesturing to a missive from Margaret. "Vesper and several high-ranking committee members have been apprehended. The evidence is overwhelming, their plans laid bare." I exhaled, relief mingling with caution. So the threat is neutralized. Holmes shook his head. Not entirely. The committee's grasp extended deep into Parliament and beyond. Several influential figures remain at large, their identities obscured by layers of deception. He tapped the table thoughtfully. "And then there is the matter of Finch Prime." I looked up sharply. "You mean the automaton we disabled?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. It vanished during the raids. Despite exhaustive searches, no trace was found." A silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Before I could respond, a sharp rap echoed at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a sealed telegram, its wax seal broken and edges stained with a faint smudge of coal dust. Holmes took it and read swiftly, his eyes narrowing. "An urgent dispatch from Lestrade," he announced. "There has been a grisly discovery near the Thames embankment. A body, or what remains of one, found in the mud at low tide." Curiosity and apprehension propelled us to the scene, where a small crowd had gathered under the flicker of gas lamps. The tide had receded, revealing a twisted heap of metal and torn fabric. Upon closer inspection, the unmistakable form of Finch Prime lay exposed, its casing fractured, internal gears scattered, and the eyes, once glowing with eerie blue light, now extinguished forever. Lestrade approached, grim-faced. "This was no accident. The damage suggests sabotage, and the body was dragged here, likely dumped from a boat. We've no clue who's responsible." Holmes knelt beside the wreckage, examining the remains with practiced scrutiny. "The destruction is precise, designed not merely to disable, but to send a message." I shuddered. "A message to whom?" Holmes's gaze lifted, steady and resolute. "To us, Watson. To all who dare oppose the committee's vision. Finch Prime was more than a machine. It was a symbol." We returned to Baker Street burdened by this grim signpost, the knowledge that the battle for London's soul was far from over. Days later, Margaret arrived bearing intelligence of a gathering, a conclave of remaining committee sympathizers intent on regrouping and accelerating their plans. The location was a disused warehouse in Whitechapel, chosen for its labyrinthine corridors and proximity to the river, facilitating discreet comings and goings. Holmes and I, alongside Lestrade and a small contingent of trusted allies, prepared for what might be our final confrontation. Under the cloak of darkness, we approached the warehouse. The fog lay thick and suffocating, muffling footsteps and swallowing light. Inside, the air was electric with anticipation. Figures moved in shadows, their voices low and urgent. Holmes motioned for silence as we concealed ourselves behind crates and machinery. From this vantage, we could hear the speakers, a man with a voice cold and commanding, rallying his followers to the cause of mechanized order. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the crowd, a new automaton, its design more advanced and menacing than Finch Prime, with seamless joints and a visage devoid of humanity. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Prometheus, he whispered. The assembly grew restless as the machine stepped forward, issuing commands with a voice that was neither mechanical nor fully human, but something in between. Our moment to act had come. Lestrade gave the signal, and chaos erupted. Shots rang out, and the air filled with shouts and the grinding of gears. Holmes led the charge, dismantling the machine with precise strikes, while Margaret and the others secured the conspirators. When the dust settled, the warehouse was silent save for our heavy breathing and the distant wail of sirens. Holmes turned to me, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "This marks the end of the committee's reign of terror," he declared, "at least for now." Yet, as I looked into his eyes, I saw the unyielding fire of a man who knew the war against tyranny, whether human or machine, was eternal. And as London slowly returned to its rhythm, with fog lifting and dawn breaking over the Thames, I understood that the tale of the policeman who never existed was but one chapter in a story that would be told again and again, wherever liberty faced the cold shadow of control. The morning that followed our confrontation at the Whitechapel warehouse dawned with a fragile calm. The streets of London, veiled in a pale mist, seemed to hold their breath as if uncertain whether to resume their familiar cadence or brace for the unseen tremors beneath the surface. Holmes, ever the vigilant sentinel, was already at his desk when I rose, his gaze fixed on a collection of notes and dispatches from Lestrade. "Watson," he said without looking up, "this matter, while seemingly concluded, is but a single thread in a far greater tapestry. The committee's infrastructure remains scattered, their ideology seeded in places we have yet to uncover." I poured 2 cups of tea, setting one before him as he finally raised his eyes. "And what then? Do we chase shadows indefinitely?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not shadows, my dear fellow, but truths. The vigilance of a detective is perpetual. The battle for liberty requires unyielding resolve." Our reflections were interrupted by a soft knock. Margaret Hale entered, her presence a quiet strength amid the turmoil. In her hand, she held a bundle of letters, correspondence recently intercepted and decoded. "These were sent in the days leading up to the warehouse raid," she explained, "from various individuals sympathetic to the committee's cause. Their network extends beyond England, into the continent, even America. This is not merely a domestic concern." Holmes took the letters, scanning them with rapid eyes. "International influence," he murmured. "A broader conflict between progress defined by control and progress defined by freedom." He folded the papers deliberately. "We must prepare accordingly." Days turned into weeks as we collaborated with officials and allies abroad, sharing intelligence and thwarting further attempts to deploy mechanized enforcement. Each victory was a respite, a momentary reprieve in a struggle that seemed without end. Yet amid this tumult, there were moments of profound humanity, conversations by the fire at Baker Street, where Holmes's sharp mind softened in the warmth of companionship, and where I chronicled not only the facts, but the very spirit of our endeavor. One evening, as the gaslight flickered and the city's murmur faded into silence, Holmes confided, "This case has tested not only our intellect, but our faith in mankind's capacity to govern itself." I nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "And what of the future?" He leaned back, eyes distant yet unwavering. "The future is unwritten, Watson. But as long as there are those willing to question, to challenge, to protect the delicate balance between order and freedom, hope endures." As dawn broke over London, casting golden light upon the Thames and awakening the city's restless heart, I knew that the tale of the policeman who never existed was more than a singular mystery. It was a testament to the enduring struggle for justice in an age of unprecedented change. And with Holmes by my side, I was certain that no shadow, no matter how cunningly cast, would remain unchallenged. The soft clatter of footsteps along the corridor roused me from a restless sleep, and I found Holmes already dressed, standing by the window with his customary steely gaze fixed on the fog-laden streets of London. The morning light struggled through the mist, casting muted shadows that seemed to dance with secrets yet unveiled. "Watson," he said without turning, "there is a matter demanding our immediate attention. Lestrade has sent word of an unusual occurrence at Scotland Yard." I dressed hastily, curiosity sharpening my senses. Holmes was already preparing his coat and hat, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his fingers. We set out through the misty streets, the city stirring with its usual cadence, yet bearing the weight of unspoken tensions. Upon arrival at Scotland Yard, we were met by Lestrade, his countenance grave. "Gentlemen, an anonymous tip led us to a locked cabinet in one of the archives. Inside, we found a collection of documents, blueprints, correspondence, and logs that suggest the committee's reach may be far greater than previously thought." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark of determination. "Let us see these documents at once." The archive room was dimly lit, the musty air heavy with the scent of aging paper. Lestrade carefully laid out the papers on a broad oak table. The blueprints detailed increasingly sophisticated automata designs, units capable of subtle mimicry, infiltration, and even manipulation of human behavior through psychological algorithms. Here, Holmes pointed to a series of diagrams, are models designed not merely for enforcement, but for subterfuge. Machines that walk unnoticed among us, indistinguishable from men. I shivered, the notion chilling. Spies in the guise of constables. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The committee's ambition was not merely to control by force, but to erode trust itself." A folded letter caught my eye, bearing an unfamiliar seal. Holmes broke it open and read aloud a passage. "The final phase commences with the election cycle. Influence shall be secured through persuasion and stealth. The city will fall before the people even perceive the change." Holmes's jaw tightened. They aimed to manipulate the very fabric of governance. Lestrade frowned. "Do we know where these machines might be deployed?" Margaret, who had joined us quietly, pointed to a marked map of London's electoral districts. "Several key locations are indicated here, places where votes will be swayed through intimidation or subtle interference." Holmes stood, resolve hardening. Then we must act swiftly to prevent this final descent. In the days that followed, we coordinated a discreet yet effective campaign, exposing committee sympathizers, safeguarding polling stations, and unveiling the existence of these insidious machines to key officials and the public alike. On the eve of the election, Holmes and I patrolled the streets near one such district, the fog weaving its timeless shroud around gas lamps and narrow alleys. Our vigilance was rewarded when we encountered a figure moving with mechanical precision, a man whose every gesture betrayed an uncanny rigidity. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Another automaton, Watson, but one designed for subtlety." We shadowed the figure discreetly as it approached a gathering of voters. The machine's voice was modulated, persuasive yet dispassionate, attempting to influence opinions with calculated rhetoric. Holmes intervened, drawing the crowd's attention with a timely question that exposed the automaton's unnatural cadence. Startled, the machine faltered, its facade slipping. A swift action from Lestrade's officers led to its capture, the device's true nature revealed to all. The incident sparked public outcry and accelerated efforts to dismantle the committee's network. Laws were enacted, oversight committees formed, and a vigilant citizenry emerged determined to safeguard their freedoms. Back at Baker Street, Holmes reflected, the battle we fought was not only against machines or conspirators, but against the erosion of trust and the very essence of what it means to be human. I nodded in agreement, pen poised to capture these final thoughts. As the city breathed a tentative sigh of relief, The tale of the policeman who never existed became a cautionary legend, a reminder that vigilance and reason must forever stand guard against the shadows that seek to undermine liberty. And with Holmes by my side, I remained confident that no deception, no matter how cleverly disguised, would remain beyond the reach of justice. The days that followed the election were suffused with a palpable shift in London's atmosphere. Though the fog still clung to the streets with its usual tenacity, there was a renewed vigor among the populace, a mingling of relief and cautious hope. Yet Holmes and I knew better than to believe that the defeat of one scheme signaled the end of such machinations. The war against tyranny, whether cloaked in steel or hidden beneath suits and speeches, was ceaseless. At Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, a pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes deep in thought. I watched him, sensing the gears turning, beneath that serene exterior. After a long pause, he spoke. "Watson, it is a peculiar paradox that in dismantling the machinery of oppression, we also reveal how easily the seeds of fear and control take root in the human mind." I nodded slowly. "And yet, it is our duty to remain vigilant, to remind those in power that freedom demands perpetual defense." Holmes smiled faintly, tapping ashes into the tray. "Indeed, but the lesson here extends beyond politics and technology. It is about the essence of humanity, the capacity for reason, empathy, and choice." Our discourse was interrupted by a soft knock. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a letter bearing the seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes broke the wax carefully and scanned the contents. "Lestrade writes of a new development," Holmes said, "a series of unexplained disappearances across the city, individuals connected to the committee's operations before their fall." My heart quickened. Assassinations. Holmes shrugged. Perhaps. Or a final purge. Those who would rather silence their past than face justice. Within hours, we found ourselves on the trail once more, racing through London's labyrinthine alleys and docks, chasing shadows that seemed to dissolve at every turn. Our investigation led us to a decrepit warehouse by the river, its walls scarred with neglect and whispered secrets. Inside, amid the detritus of forgotten commerce, we discovered a clandestine gathering, figures cloaked in anonymity, conspiring in hushed tones. Holmes's keen eye caught a familiar emblem, barely visible beneath a tattered coat, a symbol linked to remnants of the committee. We listened as plans unfurled, strategies to resurrect their influence through blackmail, manipulation, and the unspoken threat of returning machines. Their resolve was chilling, their conviction unyielding. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, his expression resolute. "This fight is not merely for control of a city, Watson, but for the soul of civilization itself." We acted swiftly, summoning Lestrade and his men to disrupt the assembly. The ensuing confrontation was tense yet decisive, ending with the capture of key conspirators and the seizure of documents outlining plans to rebuild the mechanized enforcers in secret. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out the recovered papers, his fingers tracing the delicate scripts and technical diagrams. "These designs," he said gravely, "reflect an evolution, machines that learn not only from data, but from the very fears and desires of their human counterparts. The committee sought not just to enforce law, but to shape thought." I shuddered. A puppeteer's strings woven into the fabric of society. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The challenge now is to ensure such power remains accountable, lest it consume us all." Our efforts to expose these lingering threats were bolstered by alliances forged in the wake of the committee's fall. Journalists unafraid to reveal the truth, politicians committed to transparency, and citizens vigilant against encroachment on their freedoms. As months passed, London slowly reclaimed its rhythm. The gas lamps burned steadily against the evening fog, The clatter of horse-drawn cabs filled the air, and the ever-watchful Thames flowed serenely beneath bridges that bore witness to both triumph and tragedy. In quieter moments, Holmes and I reflected on the nature of the struggle, how progress, unchecked, could become perilous, and how the human heart remained the ultimate arbiter of justice and mercy. One evening, as the hearth's glow softened the edges of the room, Holmes remarked, "The policeman who never existed was not merely a mystery of gears and deception, but a testament to the enduring conflict between control and freedom." I raised my glass. "To vigilance, then, and to those who dare to uphold liberty." Holmes smiled, the faintest twinkle in his eye. "And to the curious mind that seeks truth in the shadows." And so, with London cloaked once more in fog and possibility, our tale drew to a close, not with finality, but with the quiet certainty that as long as there were mysteries to unravel and injustices to confront, the game would continue. The final days of our investigation unfolded with a peculiar mixture of urgency and inevitability. The tangled web of the committee's remnants, the mechanized agents and shadowy conspirators had drawn us inexorably to one place, a secluded estate on the outskirts of London, where we believed the last bastion of their operation was concealed. Holmes, Margaret, Lestrade, and I approached under cover of darkness, the night thick with fog and the whisper of distant church bells. The mansion stood silent, its windows dark, save for a faint glow in the study where we surmised the heart of the scheme still beat. We gained entry through a side door, the lock yielding easily to Holmes's practiced touch. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of burning wax and old paper. The study was lined with shelves of books and mechanical parts scattered across a vast desk. There, amid blueprints and hastily scribbled notes, sat a figure, calm, composed, the unmistakable face of Mr. Elias Vesper. He rose slowly, eyes gleaming with cold intelligence. "So the famous detective and his companions arrive at last. I must congratulate you, Holmes, on unraveling so much, yet you have overlooked one crucial element." Holmes's gaze was steady. "And that would be?" Vesper smiled thinly. "The human element. You see, these machines are but extensions of human ambition and fear, but in the end, the greatest threat is not metal or code. It is man himself." With a subtle motion, a concealed panel slid open, revealing the silhouette of a finely crafted automaton. Yet this one differed. It bore no rigid posture, no artificial gaze. It was a perfect replica of Holmes himself, down to the glint in his eye. Holmes regarded it with measured surprise. "A likeness of me?" Vesper nodded. "An ideal enforcer of order, intelligent, observant, unyielding, but like you, capable of making decisions no machine could. A synthesis of man and mechanism." The room grew tense as the automaton stepped forward, voice eerily calm. "Sherlock Holmes, shall I proceed with the enforcement protocol?" Holmes met the gaze of his double unflinchingly. "You will find no obedience here." With swift precision, Holmes advanced, disrupting the automaton's balance and rendering it inert. Vesper's composure faltered for the first time. "You cannot stop progress," he hissed. Holmes's reply was quiet, but resolute. "Progress without conscience is but chaos." As Lestrade's men secured Vesper, Holmes turned to me. "This case, Watson, has taught us much. Not only about the peril of unchecked power, but of the resilience of reason and the indomitable spirit of humanity." I nodded, the weight of our journey settling around us. Outside, dawn broke, casting golden light upon London's awakening streets. The fog lifted, revealing a city scarred yet steadfast, a testament to the eternal vigilance required to preserve freedom. And as Holmes and I walked back to Baker Street, the city alive with possibility, I knew that though the policeman who never existed had been unmasked, the true detective's work, guarding truth against the shadows, would never end.